John Locke, Part 3. Cecile Fabre, Politics. Let's leave Locke to one side for a moment and take a detour through the work of Cecile Fabre. Fabre is the author of a paper with the innocuous title Justice, Fairness and World Ownership, and another paper ominously entitled Justice and the Compulsory Taking of Live Body Parts, and a book with the scarcely less chilling title Whose Body Is It Anyway? Justice and the Integrity of the Person. This contemporary political philosopher denies that the claim of self-ownership is unproblematic. She argues that if one thinks that the needy have a right to the material resources they need in order to live decent lives, one must be committed to conferring on the sick a right that the healthy give them some of the body parts they need to lead such a life. I believe that Fabre is correct in thinking that the principles that allow for the restriction of or interference with the ownership of external resources must, if one is consistent, be extendable to self-ownership. However, I believe that what her argument really shows is the incoherence of any robust form of left libertarianism, leaving the choice between her theory of body part cannibalism, which deprecates both self-ownership and the ownership of external resources, and libertarianism, which defends both self-ownership and the ownership of external resources. Fabre believes that most contemporary theories of justice hold that those who are badly off have a right to some of the resources of the well-off in order to live a decent life. Well, let's pause here for a moment. Even if it were true that most contemporary theories of justice held this, and just how many theories of justice are there, why should this be of any significance? It is also held, Fabre believes, that people should have a considerable degree of self-ownership or autonomy. She uses the two terms interchangeably. Fabre sees the right to a decent life and the right to autonomy as being in competition, and the problem with political philosophy being to reconcile them. She starts from two ordered principles of substantive justice, follows anyone, which embody these competing rights. According to Fabre, we have a principle of sufficiency, PS. This holds that people have a right to the resources they need in order to live a decent life. And a principle of autonomy, PA. This holds that once PS is satisfied for everyone, then everyone should be permitted to follow their ideas of the good and enjoy the fruits of their labour. Note that these principles are ordered. Rolls again. The principle of sufficiency must be satisfied before the principle of autonomy. Once again, we might pause for some reflection. All sorts of questions might be asked about the principle of sufficiency. Where does it come from? What is its justification? Is it meant to be self-evident? As right is used in this principle, is it a claim right? If so, against whom is such a right to be made? Me? You? The state? If the state, why the state? What if there is no state, as has been the case for most of human existence? And if it's not a claim right, what kind of right is it? And so on and so on. Fabre argues that everyone has an interest in living a decent life and, in order to do so, must have access to an adequate amount of resources, food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, and so on, as well as being minimally autonomous. She notes that the provision of sufficiency for some may require the curtailment of autonomy for others, but she believes once everyone has sufficiency, then everyone should be allowed to maximize his autonomy as a matter of right, which is very decent of her. Once again, time for reflection. How is this supposed to work? How does one determine what is or what is not a level of decency? Who makes the decisions? Whom does it range over? The notion of basic decency is so vague as to make it practically impossible to allow for any autonomy at all. What is the effect of these principles of justice on property rights? Fabre claims that neither collective ownership nor unrestricted private ownership can satisfy these principles. Collective ownership violates the principle of autonomy, while unrestricted private ownership violates the principle of sufficiency. She is going to argue for a combination of both kinds of ownership rights as a way of satisfying her principles. Under Fabre's principle of sufficiency, all would get equal shares in natural resources. In the event that Peter Pan has insufficient resources, he has a right against Captain Hook that Hook cultivate his share in certain ways or allow Peter to do so. The sufficiency principle requires that neither of us singly has the right to decide by whom, whether and how the world will be used, and to enjoy the whole of the income derived from it. We both have those rights only if our life is not decent under the status quo, and if the other's life is better than ours, or more than decent, or already decent, and would not get less than decent after the decisions are made. There's shades of the standard left libertarian line here. Anyway, let's continue. Let's imagine a situation in which some people need housing and others have more than one property. In such circumstances, if, for example, taxation wouldn't do the job, justice requires that those houses be requisitioned. On the face of it, it looks as if the composite set of private and collective rights might impinge negatively on autonomy. But individuals can use the world as they wish, provided they do so in such a way that the luckless are provided for, and after that, any way they choose. Suppose someone were to object that requiring the lucky to work for the unlucky is an infringement of their autonomy. If the lucky have to work most, let alone all of their time for the unlucky, my Dworkinian opponent would argue, says Fabre, they cannot implement those identity-conferring choices of theirs which do not revolve around work, and they thus do not have a decent life. Well, this is a pretty potent objection, one would think. Fabre denies that being forced to do work you do not want to do is a form of slavery, provided your life is still decent. She finally admits that even in such a case, her composite theory of property rights does, in fact, infringe on the autonomy of the lucky, but not, she says, to an unacceptable degree. At which point, a libertarian might rudely respond, says who? She writes, the criticism that it does appears to have force only if one focuses on the situation of the lucky and overlooks the fact that if they do not work for the unlucky, the latter are not autonomous either, since they lack the material resources necessary for them to enjoy the opportunities society offers them. Such focus unacceptably fails to live up to what motivates justice in the first instance. Clearly, the lucky will suffer a loss of autonomy, but that is an unavoidable condition of securing minimum autonomy for all. So that's all right then. Once again, she mentions the, to her, acceptability of taxation and its onerousness in a bid to make her proposal seem less unappealing. She writes, conceptions of ownership which disallow restricting the lucky's control rights over the world but allow that they should be taxed can also be very detrimental to the autonomy of the lucky if they are designed in such a way as to secure justice. For justice may very well require that the income owners derive from their property be taxed to such an extent that they would have to work and do nothing but work in order to meet the needs of the unlucky, which would render their life less than decent. Do I need to point out how the argument runs neatly in the opposite direction? If you start from the unacceptability of taxation. Finally, and I have to say brazenly, she rejects the applicability of the objection that her proposal is simply unworkable. She writes, constantly checking that the allocation of ownership rights at any given time does not fall foul of justice and fairness, and modifying that allocation as necessary are likely to be very costly and difficult. Perhaps those considerations provide good reasons not to implement my proposal. Surely not. However, she thinks they cannot disqualify it as that ownership which best satisfies both justice and fairness. So, the fact that her proposal is completely unworkable, even if otherwise acceptable, isn't an argument against it. Now we come to the really interesting part. The standard libertarian view, both left and right, is that our body is beyond the reach of legitimate demands from others, whereas our personal possessions and our money are not. On the liberal view, by contrast, we are not free to use our bodies in ways we ourselves desire, even if, in so doing, we do not necessarily harm others and may in fact benefit them in some way, as in the case of prostitution or the sale of organs. The position that holds that people's bodies must not be interfered with, Fabre calls body exceptionalism. She argues that if it is the case that we are susceptible to legitimate claims on our material resources from those who would appear to need them, we are also susceptible to legitimate claims on the use of our bodies and our body parts from those who need them. Our personal services may be demanded and our body parts confiscated. Effectively, she argues that taxation, to which she thinks we have no objections, negatively affects our lifelines more extensively than, say, the forcible extraction of one of her kidneys. Who, we may again ask, is this chummy we who has no objection to taxation? Certainly not any libertarian. Why the focus on kidneys, by the way? Why not on eyes, as per Cohen? After all, if I have 2 eyes and you have none, you're much better off with gaining one than I am worse off with being reduced to one. Therefore, we should not object to the forcible extraction of one of our kidneys or the transplanting of one of our eyes. In a 1963 essay, Ayn Rand asked what she thought was a patently absurd question, to which the answer was a blindingly obvious, pun intended, no. Would you, she asked, advocate cutting out a living man's eye and giving it to a blind man so as to equalize them? If only she had lived another 30 years, she would have realized the error of her ways. I would run Fabre's argument precisely in the opposite direction. We do object to others interfering in our bodies without license, the level of objection rising with the level of intrusion. Kidney extraction ranks pretty high. That being so, by parity of argument, we object to others interfering with our rightfully acquired possessions also. If the reason for the rejection of kidney extraction were based on interference with life plans, and taxation is more devastating from that point of view, then taxation, bizarrely, would be more objectionable than forced kidney extraction. This brings us back to our starting point. There is no position so absurd that some philosopher has not held it. Fabre's account is a case in point. Her position, while consistent, is a reductio ad absurdum of the standard liberal position. She is right to see a connection between the body and material resources, and a right to accuse the liberal position of inconsistency. Libertarians would run the argument in the other direction. If conceding the legitimacy of taxation and such like leads to having to concede the right of others to use our bodies without our consent, this, turning the argument around, shows us that in protecting the autonomy of our bodies, we are also committed to a protection of our ownership of material resources. So Fabre's position has at least the merit of consistency, even if it's the consistency of the insane. If self-ownership implies some reasonably robust account of the ownership of external goods, then, if no such robust account of the ownership of external goods is tenable, self-ownership likewise becomes untenable. The libertarian position is also consistent. The left libertarian position, however, is incoherent, permitting the non-voluntary redistribution of external resources but denying the permissibility of any such redistribution of body parts. Enough of Fabre. Back to Locke. Money and the increased productivity resulting from the changed property dispositions deriving from money solve one set of problems only to give rise to others. The problem solved is the economic one. The problem it gives rise to is the political one. With the decrease in the abundance of unappropriated land, it will no longer be possible for labour to give title to property. Locke writes, "Men, by their labour, invention and arts, make increase possible, and thereby solve the economic problems that beset them in the original natural condition. But at the same time, they also make the continuance of that state impossible. The original common, however dangerous and inconvenient, is tolerable when its conditions are a plenty of raw provisions, few men, lots of room, and a general equality of weakness. But the consequences of increase are to make unowned provisions scarcer, men more numerous, and open space harder to come by. And in this new situation, there is generated a new inequality of power among men, based on the new inequality of possessions. Under these new conditions, labour can no longer give title to property or be the first measure of value, and spoiling cease to limit acquisition. Men, he says, are quickly driven into society for the protection of their property." So far, Locke has established that every man possesses a natural right to life, liberty, and estate, and that each man's property rights in external things derives ultimately from his property right in himself and his labour. The invention of money and its effect on the distribution of property changes all this, disturbing the fragile social equilibrium and making it necessary to establish a means by which the rights of property, broadly construed, can be more effectively defended. The state of nature, adequate as it might be at a certain stage of human development, suffers from certain obvious inconveniences, to use Locke's own term. It lacks a known and settled law with which to resolve disputes. It lacks disinterested judges with the authority to determine the law in disputed cases, and it lacks the power to enforce and execute the sentences of our erstwhile judges. These inconveniences are what drive men to take refuge under the established laws of government. If all men have this right to execute the law of nature, why should men ever make the move to civil society? Well, the answer, Locke thinks, is because the state of nature, even with men's power to execute the law of nature, is, to use again his term, inconvenient. In that state, there is no known or settled law, there is no known indifferent judge to adjudicate between rival claimants, and men being partial to their own causes, the lack of a neutral judge is likely to lead to escalating conflicts. And lastly, even though all men have the right to execute the law of nature, not all men have the requisite power to do so. So these drawbacks, these inconveniences of the state of nature, are sufficient to push men to form a civil society in which they can be remedied. And in this we have the original right and rise of both the legislative and executive power, as well as of the government and societies themselves, writes Locke. It's hard to disagree with the essence of Locke's analysis of the shortcomings of the state of nature. If, indeed, there were no settled law, then given that some men are corrupt, vicious, and degenerate, our lives would be uncertain, and the tensions and ambiguities attending our conduct unendurable. And even if there were laws, but no independent judges of that law, we would not be much better off. And if we had law and independent judges, but no way to enforce that law apart from our own feeble power, then we would live in a pitiable state. So, all very well. But how does Locke get from here to the establishment of a government? Well, a government for Locke is simply an agency devised by those who desire to escape the inconveniences of nature, and that agency being charged with securing everyone's property by providing against those three defects that made the state of nature so unsafe and uneasy. But, and this is vitally important, the power of government can never go further than is required to remedy those inconveniences. In making this point, Locke shows an awareness of what has come to be called the agent principle problem, the perennial problem of ensuring that agents as agents act in the interest of their principles and not in their own interest. There is then nothing obviously crazy about people's consenting to the creation of such an agency and surrendering to it certain of their rights. The particular form such an agency might take is not determined simply by the decision to create it. That requires a further decision. Locke thinks that the initial decision to create an agency requires the consent of all, but that the form of the agency can be determined by a majority. In a compact with others, each man transfers his natural rights to look to his self-preservation and to punish offenders to the Commonwealth. The right to attend to self-preservation is not transferred completely or finally to the Commonwealth, but only to the extent that such a transfer is consistent with his self-preservation and the preservation of the rest of society. The right to punish offenders, however, is completely and wholly transferred. The Commonwealth thus established by compact is established for the purpose of defending man's life, liberty, and estate, or, more succinctly, for the preservation of society, and its powers are therefore limited. The government of the Commonwealth is to operate by established and promulgated laws, these laws to be made for the good of the people. Taxes may not be raised on men's property without their consent, which consent is to be given by men themselves or their representatives. Here is one clear point where Hobbes and Locke disagree. Hobbes believes that the setting up of a single authority, subject to no limitation, and from which there can be no secession, is the only way to establish peace. Locke, on the other hand, is unable to see how such an arbitrary power could resolve the problems emerging from the state of nature. As Strauss and Cropsey note, to be subject to the arbitrary power of an uncontrolled ruler without the right or strength to defend oneself against him is a condition far worse than the state of nature. It cannot be supposed to be that to which men consented freely, for no rational creature can be supposed to change its condition with an intention to be worse. As Locke himself puts it elsewhere, as if, when men quitting the state of nature entered into society, they agreed that all of them but one should be under the restraint of laws, but that he should still retain all the liberty of the state of nature, increased with power, and made licentious by impunity. This is to think that men are so foolish that they take care to avoid what mischiefs may be done them by polecats or foxes, but are content, nay, think it safety, to be devoured by lions. I think it fair to say that both Hobbes and Locke are relatively consistent. Start with Hobbes' pessimistic conception of man, and his political conclusions inexorably follow. Start with Locke's more optimistic, but not madly optimistic conception of man, and his conclusions follow.